The first night back home, I didn't sleep. I counted the cracks in the ceiling, memorized the silence, and waited for something that never came. War had trained my body to expect chaos, to brace for impact at every distant sound, every flicker of light. But here, in a quiet neighborhood in Ohio, the silence was louder than any explosion I had ever survived. And just when I thought the worst was over, my neighbor leaned in close, her voice barely more than a breath, and whispered something that made my chest tighten again. "Don't expect much sleep tonight. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in the power of human connection even after the darkest storms, take a moment right now to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Stories like this matter because sometimes they reflect pieces of our own lives." My name is Marcus Hale. I had just returned from my third deployment overseas. The doctors called it adjustment. The therapist called it post-traumatic stress. But to me it felt like being stuck between two worlds, one where I had fought to stay alive, and one where I didn't quite know how to live anymore. My house looked exactly the same as when I left. The white paint was peeling a little more, the mailbox leaned slightly to the right, and the oak tree in the front yard had grown just enough to remind me that time had moved forward, even when I felt frozen. Inside, everything was untouched. My sister Rachel had kept it that way. She said she didn't want to erase me while I was gone, but the truth was I felt erased anyway. That evening, after unpacking a single bag and leaving the rest by the door, I stepped outside just to breathe something that wasn't recycled air or dust. That's when I saw her, my neighbor, Grace Turner. She had lived next door for years, but we'd never really spoken much before I left. She was older, maybe in her late 50s, with tired eyes that carried stories of their own. She smiled when she saw me, but it wasn't a light smile. It was the kind that held sympathy in something else, something I couldn't quite place. "You're back," she said softly. I nodded, unsure how to respond. Words had become complicated things. She stepped a little closer, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "Just don't expect much sleep tonight." I frowned, slightly confused. Before I could ask what she meant, she turned and walked back toward her house, leaving me standing there with a strange unease settling into my chest. That night, I understood. It started around midnight. A faint sound at first, like something tapping against a wall. Then it grew louder, rhythmic, persistent, almost desperate. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, every nerve in my body snapping to attention. My training kicked in instantly. I scanned the room, listening for patterns, identifying possible threats. But this wasn't a battlefield. The sound was coming from next door. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe construction, maybe a loose pipe. But then I heard something else, a voice. Muffled, strained, crying. I froze. It wasn't just noise. It was pain. Sleep never came that night. Or the next, or the one after that. Every night the same sounds returned. Knocking, scratching, crying. Sometimes louder, sometimes softer, but always there. Always pulling me back into that state of alertness I had tried so hard to escape. By the fourth night, I couldn't take it anymore. I walked over to Grace's house just before midnight. The porch light flickered slightly as I knocked on the door. It took a moment, but she opened it, her face lined with exhaustion. "You hear it too," she said, not as a question, but as a fact. "What is it?" I asked, my voice tighter than I intended. "What's going on in there?" She hesitated, then stepped aside, silently inviting me in. The house smelled faintly of medicine and something older, like memories that had been sitting untouched for too long. She led me down a narrow hallway, the sounds growing louder with each step. My heart pounded harder, but this time, it wasn't fear of combat, it was something else, something heavier. She stopped in front of a closed door. "That's my son," she said quietly. I felt something shift inside me. "His name is Caleb." She opened the door slowly. The room was dimly lit. In the corner, on a bed surrounded by scattered pillows and worn blankets, was a man who looked about my age, maybe a little younger. His body moved restlessly, his hands twitching, his head turning sharply as if reacting to things only he could see. And then I heard it clearly, the crying, the whispering, the broken fragments of words spilling out of him. It was the sound of someone fighting a war that never ended. "He was in the service too," Grace said, her voice trembling slightly. "Came back 2 years ago, but he never really came back." I stood there, unable to move. Everything about Caleb felt familiar. The tension in his body, the way his eyes darted even when they were half closed, the way he seemed trapped between reality and something else entirely. "He doesn't sleep," she continued. "Or when he does, it's like this, every night. I try to help him, but—" her voice broke. "I don't know how. For a moment I couldn't breathe, because I did know. I had been there." I stepped closer to the bed, slowly, carefully, as if approaching a wounded animal. Caleb flinched at my movement, his body tensing further. I recognized that reaction instantly. "It's okay," I said quietly, not to reassure him, but to ground myself. I sat down in a chair nearby and just stayed there. I didn't try to fix anything. I didn't try to say the right words. I just stayed. Minutes passed, then an hour. Eventually his movement slowed, his breathing steadied just slightly. It wasn't much, but it was something. Grace watched from the doorway, tears in her eyes. That night, for the first time since I returned home, I wasn't alone in my silence, and neither was he. The nights that followed became a routine. I would go next door before midnight and sit with Caleb. Sometimes he would thrash and cry. Sometimes he would just stare into nothingness. And sometimes, rarely, he would speak. Fragments at first, broken sentences, memories that didn't make sense unless you had lived them. I didn't push him. I just listened. Slowly, something began to change. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in small, almost invisible ways. His episodes became shorter. His breathing steadied more quickly. And one night, he looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time. There was recognition in his eyes, and something else. Hope. Grace started sleeping again. Not perfectly, but enough to smile in the mornings. The house felt lighter, like the weight it carried was finally beginning to lift. As for me, I realized something I hadn't expected. Helping Caleb was helping me. Every night I sat in that room, I faced the same darkness I had been running from. But this time, I wasn't alone in it. And somehow, that made it less terrifying. One night, weeks later, Caleb spoke clearly. "I thought I was the only one," he said, his voice rough but steady. I shook my head. "You're not." And for the first time since I returned from war, I believe that myself. Before this story comes to an end, I want to ask you something simple but meaningful. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever helped someone when you were struggling yourself? Your story might inspire someone else who needs it. The last night I stayed at Grace's house, everything was quiet. No knocking, no crying, just stillness. Caleb was asleep, real sleep, the kind that heals instead of haunts. Grace stood beside me, her eyes filled with gratitude I didn't know how to accept. "You gave me my son back," she said softly. I shook my head. "No," I replied. "We gave each other something." Because the truth was, I had come home expecting to fight my battles alone. I thought survival meant isolation, that healing was something you did quietly, in the dark, without anyone seeing, but I was wrong. Sometimes the path out of darkness isn't about escaping it. It's about finding someone to sit with you in it. If this story touched your heart in any way, if it reminded you of the power of compassion and the strength it takes to keep going, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps stories like this reach people who need them most. That night, I finally went back to my own house. I lay in bed, staring at the same ceiling I had memorized days before. But this time, I didn't count the cracks. I closed my eyes, and for the first time since the war ended, I slept.